introduction to the book of First Kings. The man who had everything, the richest, wisest, and most successful person of his time. If you or your sons turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I have given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them, and I will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. That's according to 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 6 to 7. The first half of 1 Kings describes a man who got life handed to him on a silver platter. The son of King David and Queen Bathsheba, young Solomon grew up in the royal palace. Early on, he astounded others with his talent for songwriting and natural history. He composed 1,005 songs and spun off 3,000 proverbs, a sampling of which were collected in the biblical book of Proverbs. Solomon became the king of Israel and received from God the special gift of wisdom. He was called the wisest man in the world, and kings and queens traveled hundreds of miles to meet him. They went away dazzled by the genius of Israel's king and by the prosperity of his nation. The best years ever. Israel reached its golden age under King Solomon, a time forever remembered with nostalgia by the Jews. Almost all the promised land lay in Israel's hands, and the nation was at peace. Literature and culture flourished. Of the people, the Bible records simply that: they clothed, they ate, they drank, and they were happy, according to chapter 4, verse 20. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones. Check on chapter 10, verse 27. Of all Solomon's accomplishments, or of all his accomplishments, one stands out above the others. He built the temple of God, the finest building in the world of that day. Almost 200,000 men labored for 7 years to complete it. Despite the successes of Solomon's reign, however, later in his life, the king had a dramatic downturn. His fall eventually brought the kingdom crashing down around him, and the second half of 1 Kings describes the grim process of dismemberment. What went wrong? How did it happen? How could the liveliest, wealthiest, most contented nation of its day slide so disastrously in one generation? As 1 Kings tells it, Solomon seemed unable to control his excesses. Reared in a palace, he loved luxury. When Israel launched its first maritime expeditions, he used them to gather such exotica as gold, ivory, apes, peacocks, and silver. He plated the floor of the temple with gold, wastefully glided over fine cedar and precious ivory, and fashioned militarily useless shields out of gold. First Kings describes the 7-year construction of the temple in elaborate detail. Pointedly notes that the construction of Solomon's palace, twice the temple size, took 13 years, according to chapter 7, verse 1. Solomon showed similar extravagance in his love life. First, he married the daughter of the Egyptian pharaoh, perhaps indicating he was relying on military alliances, not God, for the defense of his country. Then, disobeying God's specific orders, he married the princesses of Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and other nations. 700 wives in all, and 300 concubines. The entire complexion of the court changed. It became un-Jewish or non-Jewish, foreign. To please his wives, Solomon took a final terrible step. He built altars to all their gods. The one who had built the Israelites' greatest monument to God had fallen to worship idols. Rumblings of discontent in the land. To pay for building projects, Solomon instituted Israel's first national taxation system. He drafted workers for employment and kept them as virtual slaves. When bills mounted, he went so far as to cede certain northern towns in the Promised Land to another king. See chapter 9, verses 10 to 14. Resentment opened up between Israel's north and south. But the gulf separating Israel from God was even more dangerous. Previously, the people of Israel had looked to God as their leader. Now, however, the focus shifted from God in heaven to the king in Jerusalem. Solomon had even made himself the unofficial religious leader of the country, and when he slid badly, the nation soon followed. Solomon started out with every advantage of wealth, power, and wisdom. But First Kings gives this tragic conclusion. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done, according to chapter 11, verse 6. Solomon seemed obsessed with a desire to outdo anyone who had ever lived. Along the way, he failed to make God the center of his life. He achieved lasting fame in history, but as a negative example. Jesus Christ himself rendered the final verdict on Solomon and his striving for glory when he pointed to a lily growing wild in the field. Not even Solomon in all his splendor, as quoted, and he said, was dressed like one of these. Check on Matthew chapter 6, verse 29. How to read First Kings. First and Second Kings were originally one book. The same Hebrew scroll contained both. Hebrew, having no vowels, is a very compact language, and when the Book of Kings was translated into the worthier Greek and Latin, more space was needed. Translators arbitrarily split Kings. The two books, however, should be read as one. First divides neatly almost in half, with mostly good news in the first half. It tells of Israel's golden age, when King Solomon brought peace and prosperity to the nation. But he also sowed the seed for the calamities to follow. Chapter 12 marks the beginning of a civil war that ruptured Israel into two nations, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The rest of Kings describes ruler by ruler the reigns of 19 kings in the north and 19 kings and 1 queen in the south. Another book, 2nd Chronicles, covers the exact same historical period as the Book of Kings. In some cases, 2nd Chronicles adds more detail. So if a story interests you, read the parallel account there. These books of history form the background for 17 other books of the Bible, the prophets. Famous prophets such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, and Amos preached during the time of kings. Keeping 39 rulers straight can seem hopeless, especially since the book jumps back and forth between two countries. Remember, Israel was a northern kingdom with its capital in Samaria. Its kings were all unfaithful to God. Judah was a southern kingdom with its capital in Jerusalem. Almost half of its rulers remained somewhat faithful to God. The others proved disobedient. Plans for reading 1 Kings. Plan 1. An overview of 1 Kings in 4 days. Day 1. Read the introduction to 1 Kings and then chapter 3, where Solomon asked for wisdom. Day 2. Israel reaches a high point at the ceremony. Read chapter 8 through chapter 9, verse 9. Day 3. Elijah is one of the Bible's most dramatic and colorful characters. The third day, read about him in chapter 17. Now for day 4, read chapter 18, in which Elijah takes on the prophets of Baal. Now for plan 2, all of 1 Kings in 21 days. 1 chapter a day, except for day 4, wherein we read both chapters 4 and 5. Alright, so plan 1, overview of 1 Kings in 4 days. And then plan 2, all of 1 Kings in 21 days. So 22 chapters in 21 days. Alright? Introduction to the Book of 2 Kings. The Great Wars of Israel. The Promised Land turns into a battlefield of blood. So the Lord said, I will remove Judah also from my presence as I removed Israel, and I will reject Jerusalem, the city I chose, and this temple about which I said, there shall my name be, according to chapter 23, verse 27. The book of 2 Kings tells of dark days in the Promised Land. First, the northern kingdom Israel fell to the outside invaders. Then Judah, the southern kingdom, was conquered. To appreciate what those two events meant in Jewish history, consider our century's two great wars. In 1918, the bloodiest war of all time came to an end. The entire planet had chosen sides. In all, 9 million soldiers died. Survivors thought nothing could ever again match the Great War's ferocity and destruction. The war to end all wars, they called it. Yet, in a mere 20 years, a man named Adolf Hitler brought war again. In World War II, Global violence stretched from London in the west to Japan in the east. The war finally closed with a blinding mushroom cloud, an ominous portent for the future. Two large blots in history. No matter what else happens, the 20th century has been permanently stained by those two large blots, World War I and World War II. Everything else, art, literature, advances in science and medicine, fades into the background. As Second Kings tells it, something very similar occurred in the biblical nation of Israel. Two large blots spread across the land, successive invasions by foreign giants. In the long, turbulent history of the Jews, these two invasions stand out as the Great Wars, overshadowing nearly everything else. Israel falls first. The kingdom had already split into two. First Kings tells that story. Its sequel, Second Kings, describes ever-increasing tragedy. From the very first chapters, you can sense the pending crisis in the north. Not one northern king followed the ways of God. National politics slipped into an endless cycle of intrigue and revolt. Meanwhile, Elijah and Elisha intensified their attacks on the kings, and miracles broke out with unusual frequency. Assyria's campaigns, the World War I, in Israel's history, are reported in 2 Kings chapters 15 to 18. Other records of the period tell of vicious fighting. Samaria, Israel's capital, made one final heroic stand against a 2-year siege. Finally, the starving survivors surrendered, and the people of Israel were carried away into captivity. Only 2 Israelite tribes remained in the Promised Land, holding out in the tiny southern kingdom of Judah. Ultimately, King Sennacherib of Assyria turned against Judah also, penetrating all the way to the gates of Jerusalem. He leveled 46 walled cities and carried away 200,150 people, young and old, along with all their horses, mules, cattle, and possessions. He scornfully dismissed King Hezekiah as, to quote, a bird in a cage. A brief comeback. Could the tiny nation of Judah survive an onslaught? Somehow, the caged bird, Hezekiah, made a remarkable comeback, and Judah did survive for another 135 years. Still, Judah did not learn from the dramatic object lessons of Israel's destruction in the north. Most of the kings who followed Hezekiah failed dismally to obey God. Another foreign invader, Babylon, finally leveled Jerusalem in the World War II of that era. The Book of Kings ends with a bleak picture. Refugees peeking through the rubble of Jerusalem, and the Israelites enslaved by foreign powers. The temple itself, God's house, lay in ruins. Treasures carted off to Babylon. When the dust settled around 600 BC, the Israelites were scattered across the earth, not to be reunited as an independent nation for 25 centuries. All along, prophets had given eloquent warnings of what would happen to a nation that turned its back on God. but nothing makes a bigger impact than the object lesson of history itself. Ever since, Jews have looked back upon their history and seen two indelible stains. Those were the dark days of Assyria and Babylon, when everything came apart. How to read 2 Kings. The first 8 chapters of 2 Kings, full of excitement and adventure, can be read easily. They focus on the last days of the prophet Elijah and on the long life of his successor Elisha. But beginning with chapter 9, the book can become very confusing. It switches back and forth between two histories, that of Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Israel was strong initially, with 10 of the 12 tribes united there. But it proved less faithful to God and was ultimately destroyed by Assyria. Now chapters 18 to 25 cover the period after the Assyrian invasion, when only Judah existed. One important reason for studying the books of Kings and Chronicles is that they give historical background on the prophets. Elijah and Elisha appeared at a crucial turning point in the history of the northern kingdom, just as Ahab was changing the official religion from the worship of God to worship of Baal. Other prophets who wrote books of the Bible were also active during this time. Amos and Hosea concentrated their work in the northern kingdom of Israel. The following prophets lived and preached in the southern kingdom of Judah, namely Obadiah, Joel, Isaiah, Micah, Nahum, Zephaniah, Jeremiah, and Habakkuk. More prophets came later, when the Israelites were still captive in Babylon or after they returned to their homeland. The How to Read section of each book of the prophets gives a brief summary of when and where each author worked. 2 Kings, like its companion books, makes brief and sweeping judgments of each king or queen. As we read, we can look for what pleased God and what displeased Him. The 39 rulers comprise a fine study of leadership of all kinds, from the inspiring to the degenerate. Plans for reading the 2 Kings. Plan 1. An overview of 2 Kings in 3 days. So for day 1, read the introduction to 2 Kings, just like what we've done, and then proceed to chapter 5, on Elisha's miracle of healing an enemy from Aram. Day 2, read chapter 17, which gives a final summary of the decline and utter devastation of the northern kingdom of Israel. Day 3, one of the high points in 2 Kings occurred during the reign of the boy king Josiah. Read about the beginning of his reforms in chapter 22 and the first 3 verses of chapter 23. Now for plan 2, all of 2 Kings in 25 days, 1 chapter a day. So again for plan 1, or overview of 2 Kings in 3 days. For day 1, introduction, and then proceed to chapter 5. Day 2, chapter 17, and then day 3, chapter 22, and the first 3 verses of chapter 23. Now for plan 2, all of 2 Kings in 25 days. Chapters, there are 25 chapters, so 1 chapter a day. Alright? So that's all for now, and God bless us all.